I am back with the series of Introduction to Macroeconomics. I am Professor Anuradha Jain, Professor of Economics in Vivekananda Institute of Professional Studies. Today we will be discussing about aggregate demand, which is a very, very important concept in the study of economics and macroeconomics in particular. Keynes in his macroeconomic analysis used these concepts which is related to aggregate demand and supply to the levels of national income. Concerned as he was with the problem of an economy under the grip of depression characterized by demand deficiency and excess capacity in the economy, he assumed that price level to remain constant. On the other hand, classical economists thought national output or income was determined by real factors such as capital stock, state of technology, labor supply, and in no way was affected by the general price level, which was determined by the quantity theory of money. This classical doctrine in generally referred to as classical dichotomy. So therefore, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, determination of income and employment with flexible price level highlights the breakdown of classical dichotomy. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which is generally referred to as ADAS model, is used to explain fluctuations in the output, price level, and the rate of inflation in the economy as a whole. Now, how do we define aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is an economic measurement of the total amount of demand for all finished goods and services produced in an economy in a particular year. And it is also the addition of all the individual demands in the economy. Or in other words, it can also be defined as that sum total of expenditure made by households, firms and government on domestic and foreign goods and services. And in terms of equation, we can write it as aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C stands for consumption expenditure, investment expenditure is I, G stands for government expenditure, X here is exports, and M is the import. Now, if you look at in detail the components of aggregate demand, that is consumption. So, first consumption, if we say that consumption is the total amount of goods which are purchased by the household or firms or government for the consumption purpose, and any of the sector can demand these goods in the economy. Investment demands is the demand for the production of the capital goods, that means that is for the generation of income further, and investment is done normally by the firms or by the government sector, and here it is inversely related to the rate of interest. If rate of interest goes down, then investment increases and vice versa. Government expenditure is the next component of aggregate demand, as you have seen in the equation, that is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So, government expenditure is basically the expenditure by the government either when they purchase goods or for the development of infrastructure or maybe for the welfare of the economy, welfare of the public. Government expenditure keep on increasing or decreasing depending upon the situation of the economy. Now, as you know that if we take the recent example, then government expenditure on health sector has increased during the COVID time. Net exports is the last component of aggregate demand, X minus M. X stands for exports and M stands for imports. So, if X increases or X minus M net exports increases, it means that it will lead to increase in the aggregate demand, because that leads to increase in the demand for your products. If you are exporting more and importing less, that means the demand for your product is more, and therefore X minus M, if it is positive, if it increases, then total aggregate demand increases. So, these are the basically four main component of aggregate demand, that is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, if you look at the aggregate demand curve, then you can see that it's a downward sloping, and it represents the quantity of all goods and services demanded by the economy at different price level. So you can see here that on x-axis we are taking output or real GDP, in other words, and on y-axis we are taking price level, general price level, and the aggregate demand curve is the downward sloping curve. And it is noticed that the aggregate demand curve, like other demand curve for individual goods that we study in microeconomics, is again the downward sloping, as I told you. And this implies that there is an inverse relationship between the price level and the quantity demanded for real GDP. That means the aggregate demand, total demand from all the sectors of the economy. That means the household sector, the corporate sector, government sector, and the foreign sector. So therefore, aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the total quantity demanded of goods and services and the general price level. And it is worth noting here that aggregate demand curve differs from the ordinary demand curve of an individual commodity with which we are concerned in microeconomics. And even though the slope are same for both, that is downward sloping from left to right. Because in microeconomics, when we talk about demand curve, individual demand curve, then it is the demand for any individual good, any individual household, or any individual commodity. Whereas when we talk about aggregate demand, then it is the total demand for the economy for all type of goods and services and from all the sectors. So even though the slope is same, even though the shape is same, both are downward sloping, but there is difference between aggregate demand and the demand. In case of a demand curve of an individual commodity, when price of a commodity rises, it will tend to be, substituted by other commodities which are its close substitute, resulting in fall in the quantity demanded of the commodity at a higher price. Because there we are considering only the one commodity, that is one individual commodity. And therefore, the slope of demand curve of an individual commodity depends mainly on the possibility of substitution between the commodity. On the other hand, as we see below, the slope of the aggregate demand curve depends on factors totally different from those that cause demand curve of an individual commodity to slope downward. So therefore, the reason for being the downward sloping demand curve differs here in case of microeconomics or in case of individual demand curve and in case of the aggregate demand curve, total demand curve. Now, if we talk about like why aggregate demand curve slopes downward, then the first effect that comes is the wealth effect. First reason for being the downward sloping aggregate demand curve, because increased price level reduces the purchasing power of wealth and assets owned by the consumers, and this forces them to decrease their spending, and therefore aggregate demand falls when price rises. Or in other words, you can say that when price increases, the real value of this wealth also goes down, and therefore what happens is, which also reduces the purchasing power of the people when price increases for this wealth and assets owned by the consumers, and this force them to decrease their spending on the other commodities as well, and therefore the total demand goes down, demand falls, and when price rises. Now, second effect is the interest rate effect. With increase in overall price level, consumption savings also falls, because when price increases, the demand also, the value of demand or the total expenditure on the commodities increases, and therefore the savings goes down, because as we have discussed in our other sessions also, that total income is equal to C plus S, that is consumption, expenditure, and the savings. So if price increases, your consumption expenditure increases, and when consumption expenditure increases, it means that your savings will go down, and they have to spend greater proportion of their income on consumption because of rising prices. So therefore the saving is going down, and this has a negative impact on saving. As a result, investment falls, which leads to fall in the aggregate demand, because when savings are less, then less amount is available for the investment purpose, and therefore when I goes down, which is the component of aggregate demand, because the four component are C plus I plus G plus X minus M, so therefore when I falls, so overall aggregate demand also falls. Another reason for fall or downward sloping aggregate demand curve is the exchange rate effect. Now, increase in overall price level increases the interest rate also, because the investment falls due to lack in the supply of loanable fund. Because what happens is, like as we have discussed earlier in the interest rate factor, that when price increases, overall price increases, your savings goes down, because more expenditure is done on the consumption goods, and if saving goes down, it means that the supply of loanable fund also goes down. And when supply of loanable funds goes down, and if you interact between the demand for money and supply for money there, then when supply is going down and demand if remain as it is, that will lead to increase in the interest rate. And this causes foreign investors to demand their domestic assets more, increasing the demand for their currency. And therefore, foreign currency value falls, and it has the effect of increasing imports and declining exports. Or in other words, also to simplify this, you can say that when price increases of the goods in our economy, then comparatively your demand for exports goes down. Why? Because it will become more expensive, for the foreigners to purchase these goods. And secondly, your imports may increase, because of the increase in the price in the economy, because of the inflation in the economy. And as a result, the net exports falls and aggregate demand also falls. So therefore, we can say that there is inverse relationship between the price and the net exports. So therefore, also that also leads to the downward sloping aggregate demand curve. So basically what we have studied now, that there are three main factors which lead to fall in the, or which lead to, there is a negative relationship between the price and aggregate demand, and which is the cause for inversely related or downward sloping aggregate demand curve, in which you can say that, to summarize again, one is the wealth effect, second is the interest rate effect, and third is the exchange rate effect. And all these three together leads to downward sloping aggregate demand curve, or inverse relationship between the price and the aggregate demand. Now, why the aggregate demand curve shift, or what causes the shift in the aggregate demand curve? Because there are two things. One is the movement along the same demand curve, and the other is the shift in the aggregate demand curve. So first we will discuss about the shift in the aggregate demand curve, because aggregate demand curve may shift rightward, may shift leftward. So changes in aggregate demand are represented by shift of the aggregate demand curve. Now an illustration of the two ways in which the aggregate demand curve can shift is shown in this figure. You can see that aggregate demand 1 first is the original aggregate demand curve, and there is shift to aggregate demand curve 2, rightward shift, and aggregate demand curve 3 to the leftward shift. So that means that aggregate demand curve can shift rightward or can shift leftward depending upon the changes in the components of the aggregate demand curve. Now rightward shift, shift to the right of the aggregate demand curve from AD1 to AD2, you can see in the diagram, means that at the same price level, the quantity demanded of real GDP has increased. That means the quantity demanded of commodity has increased at the same price. Now shift to the left to the aggregate demand curve, that you can see in the diagram, that AD1 to AD3 means that the same price level, the quantity demanded, overall aggregate demand has gone down at the same price. Now, why the shift take place? What are the reasons for shift in the aggregate demand curve? So there are this we can categorize in the change in the consumer spending. That means because there are 4 components that we have discussed in the aggregate demand, that is consumption. Okay, so if there is change in the consumption spending of the consumers, then also there will be shift in the aggregate demand curve. If there is change in investment expenditure, that is the next component I, then also there will be shift in the aggregate demand curve. Or if there is change in the government spending, that is G, or change in the net exports, that is exports minus imports. Now, what causes the shift in the aggregate demand curve to the leftward? So first, if we see that change in consumer spending, see why there is change in the consumer spending. Okay, so because maybe unfavorable conditions like economic slowdown, okay, or if there is crash in the stock market, or if there is increase in the taxes, okay, or decrease in the money supply, because it all depends upon the economic situation. Like suppose if we take example of tax, now if government increases the tax rates, then disposable income of the people goes down. And if disposable income goes down, then their demand will go down, because if they are left with the less income, obviously they will demand less. Or if there is economic slowdown because income is less during the economic slowdown, then also it affects the consumption demand. Similarly, decrease in the money supply due to policies of the government, like for example, during demonetization. Okay, money supply was less, or if government is using, contractionary monetary policy, fiscal policy, which leads to decrease in the money supply. So if there is less money supply in the economy, then people will have less money in their hands, their purchasing power will be less, so they will demand less, and so therefore C component will go down. Or emergency situation or disasters like pandemic, all of you know this pandemic situation. Okay, we are all going through the pains and sufferings of this pandemic, and that because of this the demand has gone down. Okay, because the level of income has gone down, uncertainties have increased, so therefore people try to save more and they try to consume less, so therefore that is also one of the factor of decreasing the consumption. And if consumption goes down, if C goes down, that leads to leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, because when aggregate demand goes down at the same price, if demand goes down, that means there will be leftward shift. Or now secondly, on the other hand, there can be favorable conditions also. Favorable conditions will lead to the rightward shift of the aggregate demand. Like suppose if there is stock market boom in the market, it means that people will have more income, more earnings, okay, and therefore they may demand more goods. Even foreign demand also increases, so that will shift rightward our aggregate demand. Similarly, decrease in taxes or increase in money supply, if government is using expansionary monetary policy, expansionary fiscal policy, so that will increase money supply. And if money supply increases, people will have more money in their pockets, so they will demand more, and that will lead to shift in the aggregate demand, that is rightward shift in the aggregate demand. And another case may be the subsidies, like if government gives more subsidies, it will also increase the income indirectly, or people will have more money in their hands, and therefore that will also lead to increase in the consumption, and that will lead to again the rightward shift in the aggregate demand. Okay, so it depends upon the situation, it depends upon the government policy, like whether there will be leftward shift or rightward shift in the aggregate demand. So if C increases, that means if consumption increases, then there will be rightward shift of the aggregate demand, because at the same price demand increases. And if consumption goes down, C goes down because of any reason that has mentioned here, then there will be a leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. The next component is the investment. Okay, if investment changes, I changes, then also that will lead to shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now, what are the reasons for decrease in the investment? Okay, why investment goes down? First reason may be like increase in the taxes, because if government increases taxes, prices of the commodities increases, demand for them goes down, okay, and therefore it may not be profitable for investors to invest more, because more investments are for the profit motive. And if demand goes down, profit goes down, then people may not invest more. So increase in taxes is one reason for decrease in the investment. Increase in the interest rate, yes, because interest rate is the opportunity cost of investment. Okay, so if interest rate increases, opportunity cost increases, and then firms will not be in a position to take more loan, and therefore they may not invest more in that case, so investment goes down. Or introduction of credit rationing, this is the monetary policy instrument. Okay, if credit rationing is done, more credits are not available for all the industries, so in that case also, investment goes down. And if investment goes down, then that will lead to leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Then there might be reasons for increase in the investment, opposite to what we have discussed for the decrease in the investment, like decrease in the taxes, okay, decrease in the interest rate, abolition of credit rationing, and in that cases, in this situation, when RBI or fiscal policy also approaching towards the expansionary policies, then that may lead to increase in the investment. And if investment increases, then there will be rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Another component which lead to shift in the aggregate demand curve is the government spending. Okay, another third component of the aggregate demand curve. And the examples of decrease in government expenditure may be like abolition of the schemes for poor and needy. Okay, like government introduces various schemes for poor people or needy people, like unemployment allowances, okay, for education subsidies. There are many schemes of the government for girl child they provide, okay, many scholarship schemes they provide for the education purpose. And if they abolish or if they reduces the schemes, then that will lead to decrease in the government expenditure. Or withdrawal of investments, okay, from public companies, private companies, or if they are closing, public sector undertakings, or if they are reducing, expenditure on the infrastructure. So in any of this reason, if government expenditure goes down, if there is decrease in the government spending, then that will lead to leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Similarly, if government expenditure increases, then that will lead to rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And the reasons for increase in the government expenditure may be like new projects, new infrastructure development projects if government is taking, or introducing new schemes for the poor people, for the needy people, new investments in the private sector or public sector companies, or opening of new ventures, or more spending on the defense, more spending on the infrastructure, depending upon the economic situations of the economy. Like as I gave you example, like if you see the current situation, okay, of corona, of this pandemic, then you will find that government expenditure is increasing on various sectors. Okay, government is also helping people, those who have suffered from pandemic. The government is also provide them different types of allowances. Okay, government has introduced various new schemes. Government is spending on health sector. So because of this, government spending has increased. So that will lead to the shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. The next component is change in the exports and imports. Okay, because change in exports and imports also will lead to the shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, because exports if increases, and exports may increase because of various reasons, maybe like more demand for your product in the international market, or if prices are going down for your product, that will lead to increase in the demand for your products in the international market. Or if you are producing more of imported products, if you are producing substitutes of the products which you are importing from other countries, if you start producing that, then also your net exports will go down, because your imports will go down, your exports will increase. So net exports will increase, and if net exports increases, then there will be rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And if your net exports goes down, okay, because of any of this reason, then there will be leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And export and import nowadays, because every economy is an open economy, no economy, functions in the closed setup, and no closed economy exists at present. So therefore, export and import play a very, very important role, okay, in affecting the aggregate demand of the economy. And in this case, your exchange rate of your currency matters, the prices in the economy matters, even the government policy also matters, okay, whether your exports will be more or exports will be less, or what will be your imports in the economy. But overall, you can say that if net, exports, that means export minus import, is positive, if it is more, then aggregate demand will shift rightward. And if your net exports goes down, then aggregate demand curve will shift to the leftward. Now another thing is, as we discussed, like either the aggregate demand curve shift, or there can be the movement along the same demand curve, same aggregate demand curve. Now if the change is only because of the change in the price, then there will be movement along the same demand curve. But if the other component changes other than the price, then there is a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So to conclude, we can say that when there is change in overall price level in the economy, keeping the other components like C, I, G and X minus M remaining constant, then that will lead to the shift along the same demand curve, movement along the same demand curve, that you can see here in the diagram, the arrows, you can see that when price goes down, the aggregate demand increases, okay, on the same demand curve. So in conclusion, we can say that if price changes, and because of the change in the price, if there is change in the aggregate demand, then that is considered as the movement along the same demand curve. But if there is change in the other component other than price, as we have discussed various components which changes the consumption, investment, government expenditure or X minus M, then that will lead to shift in the aggregate demand curve. So I hope you have understood this concept clearly. Thank you so much.